Hello and welcome to the Origins of Islam. Today we are looking at the emergence of al-Andalus, or Muslim Spain. We've already heard the traditional story of a Muslim invasion in 711 AD and Hispania being an Islamic emirate by 718 AD, and we've already seen how this is not true. But before we can have a deeper dive into how Hispania became Muslim, we have to go back into Syria for a minute again. As you probably remember from my previous videos, Muawiyah chose Damascus as his capital. Muawiyah was the first ruler who could unite all the Arab local lords behind him, chose Damascus because it was an important Christian pilgrimage site of the time, and then later Al-Walid built the Umayyad Mosque to hold the head of John the Baptist there. What is really strange though is that Al-Hisham, who reigned from 724 to 743, chose Resafa as his capital, which he completely rebuilt in the Persian style. Now Resafa is a puzzling choice as it was a city in ruins. The only explanation Muslim historians can give is that Al-Hisham wanted to flee from the mosquitoes and swamps of the Euphrates. But of course that's a weak rationalization. He could have still just gone to Damascus, which was an established capital with lots of nice buildings, not much to do for him in terms of reconstructing the city. So why did he choose this desert town in the middle of nowhere, which was in ruins? To understand that, we have to go back in time a bit further, and what we'll see is that Resafa was previously known as Sergiopolis, named after Saint Sergius, a Christian Arab martyr. This was also a very important Christian pilgrimage site, particularly for Arabs. We've seen before that Arab rulers took their legitimacy to rule by protecting a sanctuary. Whereas Muawiyah and his successors protected the sanctuary in Damascus, Al-Hisham chose the sanctuary in Resafa. Since both those sanctuaries are Christian, it's clear to see that we are still looking at Christians at that time. Anti-Trinitarian Christians, but certainly not Muslims. And Al-Hisham also got involved in the politics of the Church of Antioch, and he installed his friend Stephanos, who was a simple monk, as the metropolitan bishop. So again, all points towards Al-Hisham being a Christian. Al-Hisham's grandson was Abd al-Rahman, who grew up in a Christian monastery. Again, a strange place to grow up in if you're part of the Caliph's family, who is the representative of God and who stands for Islam like nobody else. Why would he send his kid to a monastery to grow up in? After Abd al-Rahman's father died, he joined his grandfather Al-Hisham in Resafa, where he got to appreciate all this Persian architecture which Al-Hisham has created there. Now, as you may know, Abd al-Rahman is the one who later became ruler in Spain. When the Abbasids disposed of the Umayyads, Abd al-Rahman could flee and made his way into Spain. There are legendary stories of how he fled into Spain. His mother was from a Berber tribe, so that's where he found refuge at first. And then from there he moved over into Spain. A lot of those stories seem legendary in nature, so it's difficult to say what is accurate and what isn't. But it seems clear that he ended up in Spain at some point, and he was successful in rallying the Spanish troops behind him and become ruler of Spain. Being influenced by his grandfather's work in Resafa, Abd al-Rahman brought Persian architecture with him. What we nowadays see as Moorish art really is Persian art, brought in by somebody who grew up in this Persian context. Rahman built the Mezquita in Cordoba, which is of course not oriented towards Mecca, because it was a church in the fashion of his home in Resafa. In 782, Elipandus becomes Archbishop of Toledo. Now he tries to unite the church under an adoptionist christology, so he was an anti-Trinitarian. So we can see this movement now growing in Spain, some 70 years after the Umayyads took over. However, Elipandus was ultimately unsuccessful. The clergy remained Catholic, but this gives us a first taste of this anti-Trinitarian current in Hispania. And it shows us that there was definitely adoptionist Christology prevalent at the time. In 839, Abd al-Rahman II convoked a Christian synod because of religious splintering. The main issue at the synod was a Christian heretical group called the Casians, and we still have the documents of that synod. We don't know what exactly those Casians believed or who they were. From the documents we have, it seems like they may have been some kind of Gnostic sect, and they definitely rejected the authority of the church. However, there is no mention of a new religion that was taking over Spain, even though that should have been the number one issue. If you're a Catholic bishop at a synod and there's a new religion taking over your country, that would be your main concern, not some Gnostic sect that is so insignificant that today we don't even know who they were or what they believed in. Now, some people may think that this may have to do with bishops being cowards and not daring to speak out against the new religion, because after all, it would have been the religion of the new rulers. But as we will see shortly, that is not the case at all. It was simply not a topic on their minds. They weren't aware of a new religion in their own country because there wasn't one. In 840, so 1 year after the synod, Bishop Alvar of Cordoba wrote a letter decrying that the people of Cordoba believed that Jesus was only a man, not the Son of God. So he was decrying an adoptionist Christology. And he wrote that they used the Gospel of Matthew to justify their beliefs, which tells us, of course, that we are dealing here with Christians, with sectarian Christians, with anti-Trinitarian Christians, but with Christians, because they're using the Gospel of Matthew, which is Christian scripture. They're not using the Quran, they're using the Gospel of Matthew. So while the Quran may have existed already in Spain, it certainly wasn't seen as scripture, but at most as a lectionary. So now we're moving 10 years further, and this is where we can see a tide change. And whereas in Syria and Persia, this evolutionary change from an anti-Trinitarian form of Christianity into Islam was very slow, in Spain it happened a lot quicker, at least the last bit. So it happened a bit later than in the East, but then all the more forceful. So around 850 we get the first attestation of a new religion. Bishop Eulogius brought a polemic against Muhammad with him from his travels to the Orient. And immediately Alvar and Eulogius position themselves against Islam. They write scathing condemnations against Muhammad, denouncing him as the Antichrist. So clearly they were not afraid to speak out against the ruling class's religion. It's just that before 850 they weren't aware of it. But now that they've visited the East, where this change had already happened, they saw clearly that this was now a new religion called Islam, and they attacked it ferociously. That was also the time when the persecution of those Trinitarian Christians started under Abd al-Rahman II. Lots and lots of Christians were killed, among them also our bishops Alvar and Eulogius. The victims of this persecution are nowadays known as the martyrs of Cordoba. Interestingly enough, it seems like there was no major outcry against these persecutions. So that tells us that on the ground, this anti-Trinitarian religion had already spread so much and I was ready to tip over into Islam, that a large number of the people in Hispania didn't see a problem with those persecutions. But of course, it's never always this black and white, and there was still a strong opposition against Islam until the 10th century. And then of course, under the Almoravid dynasty in the late 12th century, a strict Sunni Islam was prescribed for Spain, which then killed any resistance. Which then leads me to the next topic, and that is the way we romanticize Al-Andalus nowadays. And here I want to quote from a document by UNESCO, quote, "Throughout the period of Islamic rule, Al-Andalus was a remarkable example and outstanding model of tolerance. It emerged at the time of the conquest, when the Muslim conquerors undertook to preserve the freedoms of their subjects, protect their fortunes and their property, respect their churches, and ensure their defense. It demonstrates in the clearest possible way the generosity of the conqueror's conduct and policy towards the vanquished in the age of the governors, which resulted in a perfectly harmonious cohabitation and a model of peaceful coexistence between different races and religions." End quote. Now, anybody who knows the slightest bit of history or who understands the human condition in the smallest way will immediately see that this cannot possibly be true. It goes against all human experiences. But how do they justify such enormous claims? The same UNESCO document highlights Ibn Rushd, who in the West is known as Averroes, and Ibn Maymun, who is known as Maimonides, as prototypes of this Andalusian love for science and tolerance. And this is of course not just this UNESCO document. These two names are brought up again and again and again. So now let's look at them. So Averroes, he lived from 1126 to 1198. He was a physician, a jurist and philosopher, and he is often called the father of European rationalism. He's famous in the West mostly for his commentary on Aristotle. But in Spain he wasn't loved at all. He had to go into exile, his writings were banned, his legacy played no role in the Islamic world, let alone in Al-Andalus. His work was preserved by Jewish and Christian scholars, not by Muslims. So he makes for a pretty bad key witness. What about Maimonides? He was a Jewish philosopher, astronomer and physician, one of the foremost rabbinical decisors and philosophers in Jewish history. But he also had to go into exile. He had to pretend to convert to Islam in order to save his life, and was then almost killed for apostasy in his Alexandrian exile. Now, in Egypt he managed to actually have a career again, but in Spain there was no chance. Again, his works were burned and he was forgotten. The persecution of these philosophers was by no means the exception in Muslim Spain. It was the rule. While it is true that there was a brief golden era for a few decades under Caliph Yusuf ibn Tashfin at the end of the 11th century, which was the time of Averroes and Maimonides and some others, that was a historic outlier and did not leave any marks on Andalusian culture. Now, Ignaz Goldziher wrote about this already in the 19th century. He distinguished between Eastern and Western Islam. In the East, the Abbasids were patrons of science and started a program to translate Greek scientific texts into Arabic. In Spain, philosophy was always seen as exotic at best and persecuted at worst. Quote, "We are entitled to state that it was the tendency of Eastern Islam in its religious and social institutions to allow the freedom of the mind to prevail beside tradition, whereas with the Spanish and Maghribi Arabs, the system of religious and social life excluded, at least theoretically, free thinking and allowed no constitutive element beside tradition to prevail or to exert effective influence." End quote. So in other words, this underlines again that science was a Persian enterprise, which was prevalent in the East, but not in the West. But we don't just have Ignaz Goldziher, we also have al-Muqqadî, who lived from 1577 to 1632, and he was a historian of al-Andalus. And he writes, quote, "Philosophy is a science hated in Spain, which can be studied only in secrecy, just as works on it can be kept only in secrecy. The Andalusians industriously and successfully pursue all the branches of science except natural philosophy and astronomy. Although these two disciplines were studiously patronized by the upper classes, the scholars did not dare to expose them overtly for fear of the multitude. Had anyone been reputed to deliver lectures on the philosophy or to study astronomy, the multitude would have instantly branded him indelibly as an infidel. He ran the risk of being beaten in the street and having his house set on fire. Perhaps the Sultan himself, in order to gain popular favor, would have condemned the poor philosopher to death or ordered his books on philosophy to be burned." End quote. And the reason for this hate of philosophy and astronomy was the prevalence of the rigid Maliki school of jurisprudence in Al-Andalus, which contains a fixation on tradition and law and has no room for free thought. The study of the books of jurisprudence was even more important than the study of the Quran or the Hadith. Which brings us to the end of my series on Spain. And what we've learned is that the conquest of Spain by Berbers and Arabs started out as a Visigoth civil war. The invaders were anti-Trinitarian Christians, and Spanish Christians don't mention a new religion for more than a century. Church sources only mention a rise in anti-Trinitarian beliefs. Anti-Trinitarian Christianity then tips over into Islam more suddenly than in the East. And lastly, Al-Andalus was not a free-thinking utopia, rather the opposite. In the upcoming videos, we will have a closer look at how interpolations found their way into the Quran, focusing in particular on Surah 33:40, which does mention the Prophet Muhammad. So until then, thank you very much for watching and see you next time.